All right, what we know is that people who are in poverty often have a cognitive tax that forces them into short term thinking. And what we know is that long term thinking can potentially break them out of that situation they're in and help them think differently. But what they may be lacking is the tools to be able to do that. So, what I'm going to show you is a possible structure that people can use to start to think long term, change their identity, and work their way out of poverty. We're going to start with what we call an Eisenhower Square and imagine that there's two variables to this: urgent and important. And if something is more urgent or more important, we'll have it go this direction. So this would be the most urgent and most important. So typically things that are urgent um, but not important, which would be this one, get done the most when people are thinking short term. They're doing urgent but not important things, but they're not doing the things that are important as much. So when you think long term, you have to have some of the activities that you do have to be important. They can't all just be non-important things. So how do we get people to start moving from the quadrant of doing things that are only urgent and start to do things that are more important? And so I would argue that if we draw an analogy over this, the things that are urgent and important down here, this is summer. We'll call that summer. Things that are not urgent, not important, we'll call that winter. So naturally, this is spring, this is fall. So that just gives us a good analogy for thinking about this. That if something is important but not urgent, that's fall. Not urgent, not important, winter, spring, and summer. So basically, this is where work gets done. This is where the harvest is. This is where rest is, and this is where preparation is. So they're constantly staying in preparation mode, but never moving into summer, never getting the rewards of fall. So, how can we break this cycle of short term thinking and start to think long term? Well, one way of doing it is, remember when you went to grade school and then you went to middle school, you went to high school, maybe you went to college, and you had about 4 years here, about 4 years here, 4 years here, 4 years here. In each one of these scenarios of grade school, middle school, high school, college, there was a program created for you. There was a structure built, and you just went through it. But after you finished this cycle, maybe you likely didn't create a similar structure for yourself going forward into life. But what if you did? What if you started thinking of your life in terms of 4 year structures and you just kept going? So create a program for yourself. What do you think you could accomplish in 4 years if you started thinking in terms of 4 year blocks for your life? So, one way to think of this is imagine the square again, but instead of the seasons, I want you to think in terms of years. So, this is year one, year two, year three, year four. And maybe in the first year, you don't do much because it's your winter. But in the second year, you start preparing. Third year is the action, and the fourth year is the harvest. Because maybe you can't accomplish everything in 4 years, but maybe you can get started. Do a little bit of something here, a little bit of something here, a little bit of something here, and then eventually you succeed. So that's kind of the way of thinking. Now let's talk about the structure. So in order to talk about structure, we're going to talk about a question. And you might not think that a question has structure, but I think it does. Because with every question, there's always the question and the answer. But there's also a place to put the question, and there's a place to put the answer. So inherent in a question is a structure. If you know the question, like if this is known, it's filled out with something, and you know the answer, it's complete and it's all fixed. If you don't know the answer, that's variable. And if you don't know the question, that's variable. So a lot of times people who are stuck in short-term thinking don't know the question and they don't know the answer because they don't have a place for the question and they don't have a place for the answer. There's no structure. There's only variables. And you can't work when there's only variables. You have to have some structure. Imagine going to school and the teacher hands you a homework assignment and you just fill it out. You have the structure, it's the questions, you provide the answers, and there's this place to put the answers. But in life, you have to create your own worksheet. You have to create your own structure. So what if we gave you a structure for life to help you think through long-term planning? So let's go back to the quadrant. Again, thinking in long-term view, this same structure that we divided into years could be divided into quarters of a year, could be divided into the 4 weeks of a month, or it could be divided into a single day. Imagine when you wake up from winter, your morning is the spring, the summer is your midday, and the fall is the wind down of the evening. Same way at the beginning of a month, first part of the month, you're kind of preparing, kind of resting after what happened the previous month. You start preparing for things in the month. Third week, you're really grinding it out. By the fourth week, you're seeing the results. You kind of rest for the month, and then you do it all over again. So there's these natural cycles that everybody has in their days, their month, their years, and every 4 years you have a cycle like that. So what does this have to do with structure? Well, if you can begin with the end in mind, if you can say, in 4 years, I want to have a home, but right now I'm homeless. How do I get from homeless to home by going around this circle? Well, you begin with the end in mind. What would it take for me to get a home? You define it, right? So remember the two lines, the question and the answer. You put a Now you've got a spot to put the question. The question is, how do I get a home? So now we have something that's fixed. So it's not just variable, it's fixed and variable. Now all of a sudden we have something to work with. Okay? So now all we have to do is figure out, well, how do we get a home? We have 4 years to figure it out. All right, let's work backwards. And from there, you can start to say, well, if I did this here, if I did this here, if I did this here, that would likely lead to that there. And even if you missed it, you would still get way closer. What I found is that when people work towards a goal like this long term, it actually takes them way less time than they're actually working on it. What I found is that the problem is not that something can't be done. The problem is that we procrastinate doing it because we think it's going to take longer than it will. But if we actually worked on the problem, it would actually get done. That's the 4-year you.